The judge heard arguments today in the fight for medical marijuana and whether roughly 100,000 signatures in that petition drive are fraudulent. The judge overseeing the case overruled a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. A trial is expected at the end of the month. The lawsuit was brought forth by Secretary of State Bob Evnen as well as Attorney General Mike Hilgers. Judge Susan Strong proposed to potentially divide the matter into two trials. If that happens, it's likely part of the matter would be decided after Nebraskans have already voted on both medical marijuana initiatives.